Greetings, and welcome to a rather Antarctic edition of the Single Malt Review. We're going to look at something even more unusual this week. We're going to look at the Shackleton's recreation, which I will give to Dave to explain while I undress to a certain extent.
Way back in history, Mr. Shackleton and his party explored the great expanse of Antarctica. They took with them a case of whisky. They left behind themselves a case of whisky, which was in recent years uncovered under the ice, brought back here to Christchurch. A core sample, as it were, was taken for analysis, recreated painstakingly by distillers to produce a drop which perfectly mirrors the historic whisky itself, which was then returned to the ice to remain in perpetuity as a kind of museum piece back in the ice where it was discovered.
Yes, it was. Oh, and the whisky was Mackinlay's. You can still buy it, but it's probably not the same. Rare old Highland Malt whisky. And they brought over a good case of that, and except for one bottle that was missing, so someone must have snuck one back in the day, but they left the full thing there, so that was reasonably fortuitous. And so this is the recreation. Doesn't contain any of the original whisky, but in fact contains a smattering of the more modern available whiskies to sort of recreate the flavour as determined by the blender for White and Mackay, whose name eludes me, but yes, a very well-known blender there, so he probably knows his business. Oh yes, and it's actually pretty good whisky, despite. I think I got this for Christmas several years ago now, so I've been making it last. And this is the version 1. They've made a version 2, which I hear is not quite as good, which makes sense because they actually burned up some stores of irreplaceable whisky to make this Mark 1 version. They used stocks from closed distilleries, which they're never going to get back again. So the second one was never going to be quite as good as the first. But this is the first, and so we'll get this out here while we've still got some left, and you can have a wee look.
It's quite a nice
vicariously through us.
It's a very bright gold.
Yes, it is. It's a quite a good coppery gold.
It's a good full body looking colour.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing an alcohol by volume. Yes, there is 47.3.
Which was determined to be the original percent. So that's probably, it's just how that particular batch worked out back in the day. There wouldn't have been standard bottling strengths per se. It would have been how one run or another turned out would be what you got.
Either a very late 19th century or very early 20th century distillation, I assume, but the company took with them.
No, it would have been pretty much around the time. There's whiskey wouldn't have been. I mean, it's called Old Highland. It wouldn't have been exceptionally old because old whiskey is quite a modern invention, really. Old whiskey back in the day was, it was 8 years old, it was 10 years old, it was 12 years old, maybe. That was old whiskey. Old whiskey of the modern era is phenomenally old compared to
You have to
old.
be getting up at least 25 before you're calling it old, really.
Yeah. So no, old whiskey of the past was much younger than old whiskey of the future, which is a slightly confusing way of putting it, but that's just the way it was. So the first thing that I get off this, which is completely different from a modern whiskey, is I get peat from a predominantly Highland come Speyside blend. There is immediate and quite strong peat on the whisky, which is
There's a
typical
hearty hit of peat.
Yeah, typical of an old whisky like that, because when this was produced all those years ago, all of these distilleries, or at least most of them, would have had their on-site maltings, and they would have all kilned their own barley, and if they weren't using peat, they would have been using coal, and any way they did it, you would have gotten some amount of peat imparted onto the grain and subsequently the whisky. So peated whisky would have been just part and parcel of all Scotch whisky back then. It just would have been part of the deal. So not the rarity that it is today.
Well, We've smelled some history, let's taste some history.
Let's see what it's got.
It is sharp and briny. That peat is there.
It is quite strong. See, I've no idea what they've used. It's almost tastes old and young at the same time. It has the quite fiery kick of a youthful whiskey, but then it has the sort of slightly subdued maturity of something a bit older, which is probably the case. There's probably a very broad mix of both old and young whiskey in here. It's not a beginner's whiskey by any means. It's something quite strange.
I am tasting a little of the green, grassy, vegetative quality I get usually from Campbellton whiskey. It's difficult to describe. I'm probably using the incorrect term for it, but it puts me in mind of fresh green grass.
No, there is a little bit of. To me, it's more of a dry hay, like a hay bale that's just maybe gotten a bit damp and is starting to turn. It's just that little bit of Campbellton foust about it. What do you think, Sam? Coming from a sort of a layman's whiskey's perspective, what does that one speak to you?
I think it's quite nice.
It's quite nice.
I do agree with Dave's comment on the briny. It's got a little bit of that sort of salt.
It has that maritime.
Along with the peat, and I think those two go quite well together.
That's probably the smoke probably carries
like you
that
say,
through.
it hits you with a bit of a spice at the beginning, but there's also that older whiskey mellowness.
I tend to get that briny saltiness from Speyside whiskey rather than Highland, so it's got that character, but also the peat is, it's different, it really adds to it.
As for a modern example to compare it to, it's very tricky because the mainland styles which are peated are quite uncommon now, and it's not at all like an Ardmore or some other peated mainland, but then again, it's nothing like a peated Islay whiskey. It's absolutely it's a dry mainland kind of smokiness. It's not a marine peat that's coming through. There's absolutely no iodine or seaweed or anything in here at all. It's that bone dry sort of driftwood kindling sort of a mainland peaty flavour, which you really only get in largely Ardmore and more recently in a little, Ben Rummick is doing some experiments, and a few other sort of more forward-thinking distilleries are doing experiments into mainland peating, but it's that sort of thing that I'm getting. But the Springbank comparison I do very much agree with. There's almost a Kilkerran kind of a thing going on with that. Just a little bit of smoke, but a lot of maritime kind of salt coming through. It's a very difficult whiskey to really narrow down and to really quantify. I have a lot of trouble with it myself.
It could just be that I'm tasting a lot of a bourbon cask vanilla oak influence. Maybe I'm just imagining it. It may not be a bourbon cask whiskey. I have absolutely no idea.
Well,
but I'm tasting that syrupy vanilla.
That's difficult to say as well, because the original whiskey would have been, when it was produced, it would have been probably, unless I'm completely mistaken, predominantly sherry cask, but they were not necessarily first fill. They could have been second and third fill sherry casks. So just because it was a sherry whiskey doesn't mean it would have had to be a jet black, plum pudding number like the really uber sherry cask whiskies that we see cropping up from independent bottlers and so forth these days. It could have been quite a sort of a backseat sherry maturation.
Was there not already a roaring trade in the ex-bourbon casks across the
There
pond?
would have been picking up, but there wouldn't have been. The sherry cask was sort of guillotined when sherry became a protected, producer of origin, origin di controlli in the EU, and it could only be bottled in country. That is when the tide of sherry butts that came in from Spain to Bristol to become, Bristol rich cream for everybody's grandma, stopped. And that's when things really flipped on their ass and bourbon barrels became the norm. Before then, sherry casks were sort of, maybe not equally available, but they were much, much, much more common. And way back when this was produced, they would have probably made up for the majority of the casks that Scotch whisky was matured in.
I think there's a nice warming effect which would be excellent in colder climes, such as the Antarctic continent.
No, it's unknown whether they were particularly, whether Shackleton was a connoisseur himself and picked this to spec for any particular qualities, or if they just said, give us a load of whisky and a man will come and pay you, presumably. But who really knows?
Indeed.
They can't have found it that valuable because they left the whole thing in the basement. So that or they were astonishingly forgetful.
From the literature of the time, you can tell that whisky was not always the connoisseur's fine draft that it is today. For example, if you've read Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories from the period, Holmes was fond of pouring his nerve-rattled guests a whisky and soda or whisky and water to calm their shaky nerves. If they're suffering from the brain fever because of whatever conundrum is perplexing them at the time.
The brain fever, indeed.
Brain fever, in that sense, I think somebody referring to nervous shock, tension, depression.
Conceivably.
Yes.
But
it certainly never was a neat age statement, single malt Scotch whisky that he served up as always whisky and soda, whisky and water. But in this case, considering what the men went through, it's only fair to read the dedication from the box. What we have here is the enduring spirit. Mackinlay's rare old Highland Malt whisky was the spirit that fortified Shackleton's Nimrod expedition to Antarctica in 1907. This commemorative recreation celebrates the enduring heart and character of both man and whisky. 'Tis the spirit of another time. And we salute them for it. It is great to have a chance to try. Hey, it is
in every way a fascinating thing, which we're astonishingly lucky to
real time capsule
try, because the whiskey from that era is just simply gone. You know, no one kept it. Once in a while, something will turn up, but it's often lost what it was. Yes. But to have something frozen in ice is a uniquely fortunate way of preserving the whiskey that was.
We know there is a full case of this lurking in the Antarctic, in the ice where it was, but that's where it should certainly stay. It is a museum piece, it is part of history. That golden age of exploration has long since ended now. So the original Shackleton whisky, it stays on the ice, it stays there for perpetuity.
Yes,
it's
it
good
does.
to have a chance to try
so no,
the
this
expert's
is
recreation.
as close as we will come, but it's probably close enough for us. I'm having a lot of trouble putting a score on this because it's such an odd whisky. Because it's not being produced 100% for... It hasn't been made to be the best it could be. It's been made to be the most honest it could be. So I myself will have to be honest and award it a 6.5 because I think it's... As a recreation, I'm sure it's extremely faithful, but as a recreation of whiskey in the 19 whatever it was, it's a whiskey from a different time where the focus was not intrinsically on ultra high quality, ultra premium whiskey. This is a whiskey that's meant to be drunk. It's a functional whiskey. It's meant to keep you warm in the Antarctica, and that's what it did. And for me, it's a 6.5, but it's a 6.5 that I absolutely salute for what it did. It's a whiskey that went in there and did its job.
It almost can't be compared alongside young whiskey.
No, it's absolutely not a fair comparison to make. But without distorting how I make my scores, that's a 6.5 for me.
As a student of culture, of history, of literature, I can only enjoy this in its cultural context. I can't separate it out and look at it as just a whiskey. I've got to look at it as a time capsule, as a commemoration, as a celebration of something that happened well over a century ago, a real foundation of some important parts of our culture and our history. Say, if I was pushing the frontiers of human exploration and knowledge, doing things, risking life and limb to try to just expand the boundaries and learn more and go to new places, this is the kind of spirit I'd want to fuel me on those long, cold, lonely nights. I can't put a clear number on it. It is anywhere easily from a 7 to a 9, anywhere in between. It's just a remarkable experience in itself.
And what do you think, Sam?
I think I agree with Dave on the cultural aspect of it and what it means. As a whisky, I think it's a little bit confused with, as you say, the young and the old thing. It's a bit, yeah. There are other whiskies that are better. This one does have this nice sort of cultural aspect, and you can kind of think about the aspects of it as you drink it. So, yeah, it's a bit difficult to put a number on it. I think I will abstain from that.
I'd say it's like trying to look at a Rembrandt painting and trying to rate it on its number of pixels per square inch or its depth of field.
No, I think that's,
you're trying to apply today's characteristics, today's criteria to something which existed when those criteria simply weren't there.
No, I think that's an extremely valid stance to take on what is really a touchstone of something from the past, whereas something, as opposed to something that's been made for the present or for the future. It's a look back to what things were a very long time ago. So to assign a modern score, as I have done, is intrinsically unfair to the whisky. I'll do it anyway, because I'm a hard bastard like that. But I quite agree.
Just like the man himself.
I quite agree with Sam and Dave that if there was ever a whisky to abstain giving a score to, this would be the one. So to anyone that's interested and can still find a bottle, first off, if you can find the first edition, I would definitely recommend that. I have tried the second, and it's not what the first was. And if it's supposed to be a recreation of the original whisky, one that tastes significantly different, I can only be a little suspicious as to how real that second one is. I don't think it's as good, and because it's so different, I don't think it's as authentic. I think the first edition is the one to go for. It is... Now, it's probably completely unavailable. It may show up at auction. Whether or not you should go for that is entirely dependent on really how much that is worth for you. It will not be cheap, I can say that much. But one to look out for if you have any particular love or drive, especially for the whole Antarctic exploration scene, if not a connection with the expedition itself. But yes, do keep an eye out if you are particularly interested, and if you can taste it. If it shows up at a tasting, then that's probably the best way to approach it, because it's a whisky that you can get the most out of. If you taste it once and taste it carefully, then you will have had the majority of the experience. You don't necessarily need an entire bottle, except for the extremely well recreated sort of accoutrements that it comes with.
It is a very nice box.
It's a very nice box. But yes, if you can taste it and just pay for that, then you will have gotten most out of it, I think. So certainly, if you see it go past, don't miss it, because it's not something that will come around again. There's only so much of Antarctica they can dig up and find whisky in, after all. And there's not too many other places you're going to find some reliquary whisky out there. So anyway, we've gone on slightly long. We will let you go. This has been the Single Malt Review. Do check back in. We will not be long making another episode. Do join us then. Slàinte.